The Weight of Love and Letting Go. Margaret sat by the window, a cup of warm chamomile tea cradled in her hands. The morning light filtered through the lace curtains, casting soft patterns on the wooden floor. Outside, the autumn leaves drifted in slow spirals, a quiet reminder of the passage of time. It was a peaceful morning. At least, it should have been. And yet, inside her heart, there was a familiar ache, an absence she could not ignore. There was a time when she would have shared this moment with David. They would sit together, sipping tea, speaking in quiet tones about life, philosophy, and the little wonders of the day. He had been her closest friend, her kindred spirit for years, and now, he was gone. Not in the way that life takes people away, but in the way that choices do. Margaret had made the decision herself. No fights, no harsh words, just silence. The weight of an unbalanced friendship had become too much to carry, and one day, she simply let go. At first, there was relief, a lightness as if a burden had been lifted. But as days turned into weeks, she realized that cutting someone off did not erase their presence. Love, in all its forms, does not disappear so easily. She wondered, had she truly freed herself, or had she only created another kind of suffering? The Buddha taught that all suffering arises from attachment. When we cling to a person, a past, or an expectation, we invite pain. But does letting go really bring peace, or does it leave behind echoes of love that refuse to fade? Margaret sighed, tracing the rim of her cup with her finger. She had spent years studying Zen philosophy, seeking wisdom in its gentle teachings. And yet, in this moment, she felt like a student once more, standing at the edge of a lesson she had yet to fully grasp. She recalled the laughter they once shared, the conversations that stretched late into the night, the way David would tilt his head slightly when he was deep in thought, or how his eyes lit up whenever he spoke of something that moved him. Those memories were not easily cast aside. One evening, she had found an old book he had given her, a collection of Zen poetry. Flipping through the pages, she found a note he had written inside the cover. The river does not cling to the rock, yet it does not forget the way it flows around it. The words stirred something deep within her. Had she been clinging to the pain rather than embracing the lesson? As the wind stirred the leaves outside, a question arose in her mind, one that would guide her journey of reflection. What happens when you cut someone off? Do you find peace, or does another storm begin? Margaret closed her eyes and allowed herself to remember, to trace the journey of love, loss, and awakening that had brought her to this moment. And so, the story begins. The bond that once was. Margaret sat in the warmth of the afternoon sun, her fingers resting lightly on the spine of a well-worn book. She could almost hear David's voice beside her, debating philosophy, sharing quiet musings, and laughing at the simple joys of life. Their friendship had once been effortless, a natural rhythm that neither questioned nor resisted. She met David at a local Buddhist study group over 20 years ago. At first, their connection had been intellectual, built on discussions of Zen teachings and the nature of suffering. But as time passed, their bond deepened, extending beyond philosophical debates into a quiet companionship that felt as steady as the earth beneath them. They had become inseparable, two souls walking a shared path. Margaret often found comfort in their routines. Afternoon teas on her back porch, slow walks through the park where the seasons marked their passage in golden hues, and evenings filled with soft-spoken reflections on the transience of life. They understood each other in a way that few others did. David had once told her, "We are like two birds sharing the same sky, flying together but never caged." But, as with all things, change was inevitable. Over time, subtle differences began to surface. Margaret, content in her stillness, sought solace in the quietude of her days. David, on the other hand, grew restless. His interests expanded beyond their philosophical conversations. He became more engaged in the world, taking on new commitments and immersing himself in social causes. Their once seamless conversations began to shift. Margaret feeling left behind. David sensing the weight of unspoken expectations. The changes were small at first. A cancelled tea date here. A conversation that felt slightly distant there. But soon, Margaret felt a quiet sorrow settling in. Like a whisper in the back of her mind. It wasn't anger or resentment. Just an ache. An awareness that something precious was slipping away. One autumn afternoon, as they walked through the park, Margaret finally voiced the thought that had been weighing on her heart. "I feel like we're walking different paths now," she said softly. David paused, his hands in his pockets, his gaze fixed on the fallen leaves at their feet. "Maybe we always were," he admitted. The words stung, but Margaret knew they were true. Love, in any form, is not about possession, but understanding. And sometimes, understanding meant recognizing when to loosen one's grasp. As the weeks passed, the distance grew. Their meetings became less frequent, their conversations more strained. Margaret wondered if she was holding on to something that no longer existed, if her longing for the past was preventing her from embracing the present. She had always believed in the impermanence of all things, yet this truth felt harder to accept when it touched her own life. One evening, as Margaret sat alone, she picked up an old letter David had once written to her but never sent. The ink had faded slightly, but the words still carried weight. "Change is the only constant," he had written. "We must learn to flow with it, like the river that does not resist the rocks in its path, but simply moves around them." She realized then that David had always known they were drifting apart. Perhaps long before she had. He had embraced the change while she had resisted it. Sitting alone on her porch now, she ran her fingers along the rim of her teacup, feeling the warmth fade. The bond that once was had changed, not in bitterness, but in the quiet recognition that some connections, no matter how deep, must evolve or dissolve. She closed her eyes and breathed in the crisp air, allowing herself to let go, if only a little. Perhaps, she thought, this was another lesson in the art of detachment. And perhaps, true love was not about holding on, but about knowing when to set someone free. When love becomes a chain at first, Margaret had believed that love, in its purest form, would always remain effortless. But as the years passed, she began to realize that even the deepest bonds could grow heavy with time. Love, when burdened by expectations, could slowly transform from a source of joy to a quiet obligation. She had noticed the change creeping into her friendship with David, though she had ignored it for as long as she could. Their conversations, once light and filled with shared wisdom, now carried an undercurrent of tension. David had begun to withdraw, and Margaret, despite her best efforts, found herself holding on too tightly. She wanted things to stay the same, to preserve the moments that had once brought them both happiness. But in doing so, she had failed to see that holding on was only making things worse. What had once been effortless companionship had become a strained connection, weighed down by unsaid words and unmet expectations. Margaret found herself questioning everything. Had she expected too much of David? Had her love for him turned into a quiet demand for his presence? The thought unsettled her. She had always prided herself on practicing detachment, on understanding the impermanence of all things. And yet, here she was, struggling against the very nature of change. One evening, as she sat alone in her living room, she found herself staring at her phone, her fingers hovering over David's name in her contact list. She wanted to reach out, to ask him if he still felt the same way about their friendship, but something held her back. Instead, she closed her eyes and took a deep breath. She thought of the Zen teachings they had once explored together, the lessons of impermanence, of letting go, of understanding that love was not about possession. If she truly cared for David, then perhaps the kindest thing she could do was to release him from the silent weight of her expectations. Love, she realized, was never meant to be a chain. It was meant to be a river, flowing, shifting, and ever-changing. And sometimes, the most profound act of love was learning when to let go. Margaret reflected on their most recent conversations, recognizing the small hesitations in David's voice, the way he seemed preoccupied even when he was present. She realized she had been so caught up in her own longing to hold on to what they had, that she had failed to see how it was affecting him. One afternoon, she came across an old journal entry, one she had written years ago when their friendship had been filled with ease. "The best relationships are those that allow each person to grow freely," she had written. "If we try to hold on too tightly, we risk stifling the very thing that made them beautiful." The words struck her deeply, as if she were reading them for the first time. Margaret decided to step back. She stopped initiating conversations, stopped trying to maintain the rhythm of their friendship as it had once been. It wasn't easy. There were days when she ached to call him, to hear his voice, to feel that connection again. But she reminded herself that love was not about keeping someone close out of fear of losing them. It was about honoring the space they needed to grow. Weeks turned into months. The silence between them was deafening at times. But Margaret noticed something remarkable happening. As she let go of the need to control the relationship, she found herself rediscovering parts of her own life she had neglected. She spent more time in the garden, tending to the flowers that had always brought her joy. She reconnected with old friends she had unintentionally drifted away from. And most importantly, she felt a sense of peace slowly settling into her heart. One day, as she sat on her porch watching the setting sun, her phone buzzed. It was a message from David. "Thinking of you today. Hope you're doing well." A small smile formed on her lips. She didn't feel the rush of longing or the pang of sadness she had expected. Instead, she felt gratitude. Gratitude for the friendship they had shared, for the lessons they had learned, and for the space they had given each other to grow. She replied with warmth, but without expectation. "Thinking of you too. Wishing you well." Margaret set her phone down and exhaled deeply. Love was not meant to be a chain. It was meant to be a river. And for the first time in a long while, she allowed herself to flow with it, wherever it may lead. The silent goodbye. Margaret had always imagined that goodbyes were marked by grand gestures, tears, final words, perhaps even a lingering embrace. But when it finally happened, there was no dramatic farewell, no closure neatly wrapped in conversation. Instead, there was only silence. At first, the distance between her and David felt temporary, a brief pause in their long companionship. But as the days turned into weeks and the weeks into months, she realized that the absence had taken on a permanence of its own. They had let go of each other not with a deliberate goodbye, but with a quiet understanding that their paths had diverged. In the early days of separation, Margaret felt a sharp pang each time she reached for her phone, only to remember that there was no message waiting for her. She would pour an extra cup of tea out of habit before catching herself. The empty chair across from her a quiet reminder of his absence. The spaces where their friendship once thrived now felt like hollow echoes of something she wasn't sure she would ever get back. She spent many mornings walking along the same paths they had once taken together, watching the world move on without them. The park bench where they had once sat discussing philosophy now seemed lonelier. The books they had shared still lined her shelves, untouched. And yet, with each passing day, the weight of loss felt lighter, not because she had forgotten him, but because she was learning to carry their memories differently. One crisp autumn morning, Margaret found herself standing at the edge of a lake, watching the water ripple with the wind. She remembered a lesson from their Zen studies. A river does not grieve for the leaves it carries away. It simply continues to flow. In that moment, she understood. David had not truly left her. He was there in the lessons he had taught her, in the perspectives they had shared, in the way she had grown because of him. Acceptance didn't come suddenly. It was a slow, unfolding process, like the changing of seasons. Some days, she missed him with an ache so deep it stole her breath. Other days, she felt a quiet peace, knowing that their time together had been meaningful even if it wasn't forever. She started to write again, filling the pages of her journal with reflections on love, loss, and the nature of impermanence. She tended to her garden more, finding solace in the simple act of nurturing something new. And most importantly, she allowed herself to embrace the present, rather than clinging to a past that no longer existed. One afternoon, while dusting the bookshelf, she found an old note from David tucked inside one of their favorite books. It was a passage he had copied down from a Zen master. To love something is to set it free. If it returns, it was always yours. If it does not, it was never meant to stay. Margaret ran her fingers over the words, a soft smile touching her lips. She did not need him to return for his presence to remain with her. She folded the note carefully and placed it back in the book, this time without a sense of longing, only gratitude. Margaret stepped outside, breathing in the crisp evening air. The wind rustled through the trees, carrying with it the whispers of memories and the promise of new beginnings. She understood now that not all goodbyes needed words. Some were meant to be silent, not out of pain or regret, but out of the quiet reverence for what once was. With a final deep breath, she let the moment wash over her. And then, like the river she had always admired, she flowed forward, embracing the unknown.